Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Magic the Gathering, told through a card from every set. You might notice this is the longest video so far, so I hope you're excited. We've got some great sets to talk about today. Ravnica Block is one of the game's most popular, taking place on a city plane full of factions and scheming. Time Spiral Block is a fantastic experiment in set complexity, and a dig through Magic's past and present, as well as a glimpse into its future. And wedged in the middle of these two juggernauts is Coldsnap, a weird little set displaced from time. Let's get started. October 2005 saw the release of one of the most popular blocks of all time, Ravnica Block, which opened with the set Ravnica City of Guilds. In this series we've explored a few of the game's previous multicoloured sets. Legends introduced the concept, which it used to represent exciting legendary creatures, like the original Elder Dragons and this shirtless Tiger Man. Invasion was focused first on allied colour pairs and then pivoted to enemy colours with Apocalypse. Ravnica put a new spin on the concept, and one which has influenced the way many sets have been designed since. Ravnica associated every colour pair with a faction. So there are 5 colours, which can be combined in 10 unique ways, meaning there are 10 factions. And each of these factions has their own unique mechanic. Not wanting to overwhelm players with information and cause decision paralysis, however, thed factions were drip-fed throughout the block. 4 were introduced in City of Guilds, then 3 more in Guildpact, and finally 3 more in Dissension. City of Guilds introduced us to the red and white Boros Legion, the plane's military police force, the white and green Selesnya Conclave, a peace-loving collective of those in tune with nature, which may also be a front for a slightly sinister hive mind, we're not sure, the green and black Golgari Swarm, a subterranean army of the damned and the dying who live in the Undercity beneath Ravnica, and finally the black and blue House Demir, which is definitely just a mundane postal service, and not a secret espionage operation run by a psychic vampire. As mentioned earlier, each of these guilds has its own unique mechanic, which is used on many of the cards in their colours. But the card which I'll be using to represent the set doesn't have a guild mechanic at all. In fact, this card could be printed in just about any set, but despite that fact, I feel like it's distinctly Ravnican. Sky Knight Legionnaire was printed for the first time in Ravnica City of Guilds, but it's been back every time we've returned to the plane. It was in Gatecrash in 2013, and in Guilds of Ravnica in 2018. Every time we head to this plane, this rock-riding knight is always here to welcome us. Like my choice of Kurdape for Arabian Nights, I'm choosing Sky Knight Legionnaire here to represent continuity rather than change. There have been some wonderfully complex cards in Ravnican sets over the years, which have shown us interesting things which the colours can do in combination. For example, Niv Mizzet the Firemind in Gatecrash, a card also notable for having the most obnoxious joke in the game in its flavour text, is a dragon, red, as well as a wizard, blue. Whenever you draw a card, blue, Niv Mizzet deals 1 damage to target creature or player, red. You can also tap Niv Mizzet down to draw a card, blue. But Sky Knight Legionnaire proves the card doesn't need to be complex in order to be iconic. It's white, which means it can be a low-cost flyer, and it's red, meaning that it can have haste. Put those two properties together, and bam! You've got a low-cost evasive threat, which is exactly what a Boros deck wants, whether the year is 2005 or 2020. Although Ravnica Block is incredibly beloved, it's home to 2 highly controversial mechanics. The more problematic of these 2 we'll get into later in the video, but the other was brought out with the release of Guildpact in February 2006. Guildpact gave us 3 more Ravnican guilds: the Steampunk Wizards of the Izzet League, the extortionate hybrid of a mafia and a church, which is the Orzhov Syndicate, and the anarchist Gruul clans. It's the Orzhov mechanic Haunt, which is remembered as one of Ravnica's most contentious innovations. When a card with Haunt goes to the graveyard, in other words, if it's a creature when it dies, or if it's a spell after its effect is resolved, then the card with Haunt exiles itself, and then haunts a creature currently in play. When the creature being haunted dies, the Haunt card then activates a little effect. The card which I'll be using to demonstrate this is also the card which I'll be using to represent the set, Orzhov Pontiff. When Orzhov Pontiff enters play, it either grants every creature you control +1/+1, or gives every creature you don't control -1/-1. Later on, once the Pontiff has died, it's exiled and then haunts another creature, whether that creature belongs to you or an opponent. Once that haunted creature dies, the Pontiff's Enter the Battlefield ability triggers again, strengthening your creatures or weakening your opponents. Now you might be wondering, why is this controversial? Well, unlike the other troublesome Ravnican mechanic, Haunt isn't problematic due to its power level, but due to its design. Mark Rosewater places it as a 9 out of 10 on his Storm scale, the Storm scale being a rating of how likely or not a mechanic is to return. See my video on Odyssey and Onslaught block for more info. This means that Haunt is exceptionally unlikely to return. Specifically, Mark argues,
Haunt had this ungrokkable ability where people would read it and then they would forget it again because it didn't quite make logical sense. It didn't quite have the resonance. And so people kept forgetting how it worked. Like even now, I had to think really hard about how this mechanic worked. Like most mechanics I can just spit off and, okay, Haunt, how does Haunt work again? Like I have to think about it because Haunt was just, it had a neat flavor to it. Okay, I'm haunting things, you know. Orzhov is the the Guild of the Ghosts, the Ghost Council and stuff, but it just never quite clicked.
On one level, this is a valid argument. It is quite weird that a haunt card exiles itself, but then sort of hovers back into play over a creature it's haunting, and it's understandable why that's conceptually confusing. But haunt is contentious because whilst Mark Rosewater seems to dislike it,
It has some defenders among the player base.
it's undeniably quite flavourful. The notion of the ghost of your pontiff haunting another creature in play, looming menacingly over them and waiting to unleash a nasty effect is very evocative, so I'll leave it up to your own interpretation here. Is haunt a fun and spooky bit of spice, which has been unfairly dismissed, or is it a weird, mind-bending mechanic that's both forgettable and difficult to conceptualise? Dissension descended upon game stores in May 2006. It gave us Ravnica's final three guilds: the Azorius Senate, the Plains Lawmakers and Government, the Cynic Combine, the Biologists to the Izzet League's Chemists, who make amphibious abominations for funsies, and the Cult of Rakdos, a gang of backflipping, psychotic, demon-worshipping murder clowns. The card we'll be using to represent this set is Azorius Guildmage. The first thing which must catch your eye about this card is its mana cost makes use of some new symbols. Ravnica Block introduced the concept of hybrid mana. Creatures with hybrid mana in their cost can be cast using either of the two colours indicated, so Azorius Guildmage here can be cast using either white or blue mana. Hybrid mana is an interesting innovation, as hybrid cards are bound by a unique creative restriction. The abilities which they possess must be valid as though they were a monocolour creature of either of the two colours in their hybrid casting cost. For example, Boros Recruit is a hybrid red and white card, with 1/1 and first strike. As red and white are the two colours which commonly have first strike, this card works as either a red or a white card, meaning it can be cast for hybrid mana. Similarly, Gaze of the Gorgon, a hybrid black and green card, grants the targeted creature Regenerate, and an ability similar to Death Touch, which hadn't yet been keyworded. Two abilities accessible in either black or green. Hybrid mana thus allows a massively increased number of two-colour cards to be put into Ravnica sets without skewing or ruining the draft format, because hybrid cards are desirable and valid picks to players building a variety of different decks. Hybrid mana is not unique to Ravnica, however, and returned again in sets like Shadowmoor and Throne of Eldraine, this time incentivising players to build monocolour decks. This shows the versatility of hybrid mana as an ingredient in limited environments. The second notable thing about Azorius Guildmage is, well, that it's a guild mage. Guild mages are some of Ravnica's most iconic cards. Every block gives every guild its own mage. This means we've seen 30 guild mages on Ravnica on our 3 trips to the plane. The first batch of guild mages, like our Vidalkin friend here, cost hybrid mana, but then required 2 different colours of mana in order to use both of their abilities. This means you can theoretically run them in a monocolour deck, but you won't be able to get the most use out of them. The next set of guild mages from Return to Ravnica Block required 2 colours of mana, both to cast and to use either of their abilities. And the final set of guild mages need to be tapped down, restricting their abilities to a single use every turn. Which set of guild mages is the best? Well, an easy answer to that is quite tough to provide. It varies both by set and by guild. A final piece of trivia is that the guild mages of Ravnica aren't even the first guild mages in the game. Mirage gave us a cycle of monocoloured guild mages, with 2 activated abilities in 2 different colours. So that wraps up Ravnica, or at least for now. We'll be back twice more in the videos to come. Wizards of the Coast website is home to many peculiar articles, whether that's a statement on Space Godzilla, which explains the decision to rename a very unfortunately titled promotional card, to Topical Blend to Err is Human, in which Mark Rosewater discusses mistakes he's made when designing Magic cards and how they parallel mistakes he's made in his love life. Yes, that really is a thing that exists, and it's beautiful. But arguably one of the strangest of these articles, or well, one that's at least in the top 5, bears the humble title Coldsnap Q&A, and was uploaded by Randy Bueller on the 26th of October 2005. In this article, Bueller claims, quote, "I emptied out a filing cabinet in Richard Carfield's old office. Inside, I found a bunch of old folders, the bottom of which was cryptically titled Rock and Roll. Curious, I blew the dust off the file and peeked inside. I had no idea what I was about to uncover. I realised that I might have just uncovered one of the great unsolved mysteries of R&D. Yes, in my hands was the Lost Ice Age expansion." You guys remember Ice Age Block, right? We covered it way back in part 2 of this series. The intricately complex Ice Age set, then the deeply unpopular middle set, Homelands, and the concluding set, Alliances. Well, Bueller's article claims that there's an old legend, his words not mine, that at Wizards of the Coast HQ, Ice Age was designed to be the first of the modern day blocks, complete with 1 large set and 2 small expansions, but due to internal politics, Homelands was forced upon R&D to be included in the block. This forced R&D to shelve the 3rd set of the block, as there wasn't going to be room for it before Mirage was released. According to a legend, the design was filed away, never to be seen again, and rumour has it was the best set of the block. Bueller is claiming that he's just unearthed this mythical lost set from a dust, and it's due to be released into Standard in the near future. There's only one problem. Absolutely none of that is true. Several articles were brought out over the coming months, essentially announcing, wait, you guys, that whole lost set story was totally a prank. But this didn't entirely clear up the confusion. Even today, 15 years later, there are still people who think that Coldsnap is this weird sort of unearthed relic recovered from Richard Garfield's office. And I mean, you can't really blame them. That's what the official announcement said. You'd have no reason to believe they're pulling a giant prank. So Coldsnap was released in July 2006, nominally as a part of Ice Age block, sliding in to replace Homelands. It was printed and made standard legal, whilst those two sets were around a decade old. To keep up this pretense, several of the cards released in the theme decks alongside Coldsnap came from Ice Age and Alliances, meaning they were unplayable in standard and just generally sowing a lot of confusion. Coldsnap furthered many of the themes of Ice Age block, so snow permanents made their return alongside cumulative upkeep. Coldsnap has a slightly weird draft environment. Although theoretically you could draft it alongside Ice Age and Alliance boosters, that often wasn't really practical for price and availability reasons. As such, it ended up as a small set of only 155 cards, which was drafted alone. This often wasn't fun, and the card which encapsulates why is Surging Sentinels, which will be the card we're using to represent the set. Surging Sentinels is a card with Ripple, a novel mechanic featured exclusively in Coldsnap. When you play a card with Ripple, you reveal the top 4 cards of your deck, and may then play any cards which have the same name. This then triggers Ripple again, and again, and again, just as long as you have enough cards bearing that same name in your deck. This was designed to work with the small size of Coldsnap and create a unique draft experience that couldn't be replicated anywhere else. There's a cycle of cards with Ripple, 1 in each colour, and they're all common. They're not a problem in Constructed, where you're capped at 4 copies of each of them, but in Limited they can be a nightmare. Because they're all common, and not very good unless you have the Ripple deck, generally the person playing the Ripple deck would gather a bunch of them together and make an unbeatable engine, while there'd be useless pieces of chaff to everyone else at the table. A single 2-1 with First Strike for 3 mana is unremarkable. 2 of them is good, and 3 or more is insane value. That's not even getting into Surging Flame, which could theoretically let you end the game on turn 2. Although the Flame isn't quite as much of an issue as the Sergeant, as it's potentially playable outside of a Ripple deck, meaning there's a chance one player won't monopolise them all. Surging Might follows a similar pattern to the Sentinels, where it's bad if you only get off 1 copy, and great if you get off more in one swoop. Surging Ether is either an overcosted boomerang, or it forces your opponent to return their entire board to their hand, and Surging Dementia can have your opponents pitching either their entire hand or just a single card. The massive variance in the quality of Ripple cards, depending on how many you can gather, as well as the luck involved in getting them to go off, as well as the aforementioned way it would warp how drafting works, ensure that Coldsnap is not remembered well for its limited environment. It's mostly remembered because of a weird prank involving its design story, and its attempt to be an homage to Magic's past, something which the next set would pull off with far greater effectiveness. If different Magic blocks were films, what sort of films would they be? Invasion would be something like Independence Day, where it's focused on coming together to fight off extraplanar invaders. Mirrodin would be Transformers, where it's focused on machines and explosive levels of power. Time Spiral would be an art house film, like something by David Lynch or Terrence Malick. Enlightening, explorative and insightful if you get it, but obtuse, overly complex, and inapproachably hostile if you don't. Released in October 2006, Time Spiral was the first in a series of 3 deeply experimental sets. It was decided to use the free set structure of Magic blocks to explore the game's past, its present, sort of, we'll get to that when we get to Planar Chaos, and its future. As such, Time Spiral is a deep dive into Magic's history. This is most clearly seen by looking at the sheet of time-shifted cards, which the block contained. Iconic cards from the game's past, like a Chroma Angel of Wrath and Nicole Bolas, which were slipped into Time Spiral packs, whilst retaining their classic borders. Each of the sets of Time Spiral block sold quite poorly, but that isn't to say they're bad sets. None of what I've said is to imply that. If you're an invested player, Time Spiral is a fantastic experience, and offers a level of nuance and complexity which few sets before or since have been able to offer. But if you're a new player, it presents a hurdle which is almost impossible to overcome. Imagine you're a new player, and you're doing one of your first drafts ever, and you see a card like this. You have no clue what the stack is, and this is just one uncommon card. You still have a whole pack left to process. This is compounded by the huge number of mechanics every set in Time Spiral block contained. Excluding evergreen keywords, which are in every set, like Flying, First Strike, Trample, etc., most sets have a small collection of keyword mechanics. Things like Convoke, Bushido, etc. Ravnica City of Guilds had 4, 1 per guild. Time Spiral has 11. You're probably thinking, wow, that's quite a lot. But maybe that's not unmanageable. Future Sight has 36. Now, granted, several of these, like Double Strike, Lifelink, and Scry, were later made either evergreen or significantly more commonplace, but even culling mechanics like that, Future Sight still has 29 keywords for players to wrap their heads around, some of which, like Morph, Split Second, and Storm, are really quite convoluted. There's only been one set released since Time Spiral block which has attempted to have anywhere near that level of complexity. 2019's Modern Horizons also explored Magic's past and contained an incredibly deep well of mechanics. This got around the issue presented by Time Spiral as it never went into Standard, and thus newer players never had to experience it. The art house cinema was still open, but it was optional rather than mandatory viewing. That's not to say Modern Horizons is perfect. It was sold for an elevated price compared to Time Spiral, and its power level was arguably a little bit too high, as a certain Arisen Necropolis can attest. But it's the closest we're ever going to get to a Time Spiral 2. And given the set is abbreviated as MH1, it seems as though more similar sets are due. In any case, that's a sort of summary of the whole block, as well as its merits and flaws. But what card am I actually choosing to represent this set? I'm going to go with Jaya Ballard, Task Mage, probably the most iconic card from the set. Jaya Ballard is an interesting card because she's a sort of prototype of a Planeswalker. Planeswalkers as a card type were introduced in Lorwyn, the block after Time Spiral. Jaya sort of laid the groundwork for them. Just as Planeswalkers have free loyalty abilities of gradually increasing costs, Jaya has free activated abilities of increasing costs. Still a popular commander, Jaya is an interesting part of the game's history, as well as a sort of proto-Planeswalker. Planar Chaos came out in February 2007. I mentioned earlier that it fits into Time Spiral Block's chronology-based structure, sort of representing the present. Let me clarify what I mean by that. In the storyline of Time Spiral Block, weird time rifts were opening all over the plane of Dominaria. Some of these rifts led neither into the past or the future, however, but instead into an alternative present, where the colours of magic work in a fundamentally different way. Enter Planar Chaos, which represents this weird alternative universe where all the colours work differently. Let me give an example. Serra Angel is one of White's most iconic cards. An angel with vigilance and flying, it makes perfect sense for Serra Angel to be in white. Angels are White's iconic creature type, and Vigilance is an ability which appears primarily on white cards. It represents White's patience and tirelessness when pursuing justice and other causes which it cares about. Flying also appears secondarily in white, meaning it makes sense for it to be on this card. In Planar Chaos, we get a colour shifted homage to Serra Angel with the card Serra Sphinx. Transforming from White's iconic creature type into blues, blue is the colour where flying appears primarily, so a lot of this card could be printed on any set. But Vigilance is what makes this a Planar Chaos card, as Vigilance is not in Blue's slice of a colour pie. But Planar Chaos' unique gimmick is that it shifts abilities to new sections of a colour pie where they would theoretically make sense. We can imagine another world where it could be justified that Blue has Vigilance, as it represents the colour's patience and its diligence in its search for knowledge. But Serra Sphinx isn't the card which I'll be using to represent Planar Chaos. By far the most significant colour shifted card in the game is Damnation. Wrath of God is an incredibly notable white card. It destroys every single creature in play, an effect which works in white due to its symmetrical nature. You're destroying all of your opponent's creatures, but also all of your own. This represents how justice, a concept which white cares about a lot, is blind, and applied equally to all. Damnation is the same effect, but printed on a black card, here instead representing black's unlimited capacity for destruction in order to get what it wants. There's also a neat parallel in that Wrath of God is exploding outwards, wiping away everything in its path, while Damnation is imploding, drawing people inwards to their doom. I've chosen Damnation specifically because it's a card which people really want to see a reprint of, but which Wizards seems remiss to provide. Wizards are a bit mixed on reprinting Planar Chaos cards. Mark Rosewater has stated he slightly regrets designing the set at all, as it breaks the colour pie, which is a fundamental part of Magic's balance, and it's hard to recork this genie once it's been let out of the bottle. This might explain the lack of reprints of notable cards like Damnation from this set. We now come to the final set in Time Spiral Block, Future Sight, which came out in May 2007. As its name implies, the theme of Future Sight is the future. Future Sight contains several future-shifted cards, which are cards from the future. Sort of. Let me explain. All of these future-shifted cards have strange, sort of futuristic-looking borders. Some of these future-shifted cards are indeed preview cards which were then released again later on. For example, Aven Mind Sensor was a future-shifted card from Future Sight, which came out again 10 years later in Amonkhet. Nessian Corsair foreshadowed the world of Feros 6 years early, and Steamflugger Boss was even a preview of a card from a joke set, Unstable.
The majority of these future-shifted cards, however, were experimental designs, which pushed into strange new places not yet explored.
For example, the card Tarmogoyf got stronger for each different type of card in your graveyard, with reminder text stating the card types are Artifact, Creature, Enchantment, Instant, Land, Planeswalker, Sorcery, and Tribal. To a player reading this in 2007, two things would be utterly confusing. Number one, what does Tribal mean in this context? Though there is another card from Future Sight, Bound in Silence, which has the card type Tribal Enchantment, so I guess maybe there's something which they could figure out. But the biggest question raised by this reminder text for a player in 2007 would be just what the hell a Planeswalker is. Perhaps if they were savvy about Magic's story, they'd know that many of its major characters were Planeswalkers, but Planeswalkers as a card type didn't yet exist, and wouldn't exist until Lorwyn came out in October to clear everything up. Tarmogoyf's reminder text here is just one example of how Future Sight messed with people's heads. The card which we'll be using to represent Future Sight is another of these future shifted cards, Bridge from Below. Bridge from Below is an enchantment which reads, whenever a non-token creature is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, if Bridge from Below is in your graveyard, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. When a creature is put into your opponent's graveyard from the battlefield, if Bridge from Below is in your graveyard, exile Bridge from Below. The card is possibly most famous now for being banned from Modern in July 2019, a decision widely seen as it taking the bullet for the more problematic but newer card, Hogak the Arisen Necropolis. But, though that may be what Bridge from Below is famous for now, in its time it was well known for the role it played in dredge decks. Do you remember when I mentioned that Haunt was the second most controversial mechanic from Ravnica block? Well, that's because dredge was first with a bullet. Cards with dredge can be drawn out of your graveyard during your draw step, but in return, you don't draw a card from the top of your deck in that turn, and have to put a certain number of cards from the top of your deck into your graveyard as well. So, for example, Golgari Grave Troll has dredge 6, meaning that if you have it in your graveyard at the start of your turn, you can put the top 6 cards of your deck into your graveyard in order to put it back into your hand. Given that Golgari Grave Troll gets stronger the more creature cards are in your graveyard, you can probably see where the problem lies. Generally, the problem with dredge can be condensed down to the fact that dumping cards from your deck into your graveyard actually provides a massive advantage. It lets you fill your graveyard with tough creatures to reanimate, and dredge cards that can be fetched back to your hand, many of which have effect which benefit from the massive number of cards you've been ditching. Dredge decks dominated Modern for a long time, and became infamous due to their high level of power, forcing opponents to sideboard in graveyard hate cards like Rest in Peace in order to play against them. This ultimately resulted in the ban of one of the most iconic dredge cards, Golgari Grave Troll, in January 2016. So where does Bridge from Below fit into all of this? Well, it's an enchantment which only works when it's in your graveyard. Something which is easy to accomplish with dredge ditching so many cards at the start of each of your turns. Its effect generates a zombie token for you each time one of your creatures dies, something that's easy to accomplish as a dredge deck tends to have a lot of expendable little chump blockers like Narcomoeba and Golgari Fug. Given that you can have multiple copies of Bridge from Below, you might even be getting 2 or 3 zombies into play each time one of your creatures dies. You just need to be careful about not killing any of your opponent's stuff until the time is right, and you can swing in with your zombie horde, alongside a huge reanimated threat for a game-winning blow. Though the days of Dredge's dominance have now passed, other strategies have risen in power, and Dredge's most problematic pieces have been banned, it will still go down in history as one of the game's most famous deck archetypes. So there we have it. 2 of the most significant and meaningful blocks in the game's history. And also Coldsnap. But join me next time for another series of 7 sets, when we look at the Celtic-inspired plains of Lorwyn and Shadowmoor, followed by the divided world of Alara. Goodbye!